Which sin often gets overlooked in the lives of believers? Hi, I'm Ken Yates from Grace Evangelical Society, and I would like to answer that question, or at least give my opinion on it, because I'm sure there are other sins that would qualify as an answer to that question. But I want to suggest one in particular, and it is, we can word it in different ways, pride, or maybe when we think too highly of ourselves. That is something that occurs in the church and among believers that we often minimize. Or it's a sin that we perhaps see, perhaps we do it in our own lives, but we don't really take it that seriously. It's not a big deal. It's not like, one of the dirty dozen or the nasty nine or something like that. But I think when we read the New Testament a little bit closer, we find that not only is it a serious sin, or when I mean serious, I mean that it causes problems with not only in our own lives, but in the life of the church among other believers. But it's also a sin that we can very easily excuse and not even notice. And I just want to look at a few places where we see how serious this issue is, and that it is evidently a common problem. So it's serious, but it's common. It's all too common. I was reminded of this just recently in one of the Zoom classes that we have for Grace Evangelical Society, where we're going through the book of Romans. And Paul discusses this particular problem in Romans chapter 12. And right off the bat, it seems to me that we can say that the reason why Paul discusses it is because he knew it was a problem, if not in Rome specifically, in his missionary journeys. As he was dealing with various churches, it was something that he often saw, and so he felt the need to address it. Or maybe specifically the church at Rome, he had heard that, as in other churches, this was a problem, so he does it. And so in Romans chapter 12, verse 16, Paul says, "Be of the same mind toward one another." Now, it seems to me that what that means is, don't think of yourself as better than others. Don't be proudful in your relationship with others. Do not set your mind on high things. Whatever else Paul would mean by that is, I think so highly of myself, I think that I'm worthy of whatever it is that I am setting my mind upon, and others don't deserve it as much as I do. And then he says, associate with the humble. Now, it seems to me that what he means by that is one of the ways you can combat this tendency that we all have, which is to think too highly of ourselves, to be proud, to maybe look down at others, is we also have a tendency to want to rub shoulders with those people who are important. Paul says, one of the ways you can avoid this common and destructive sin is to associate yourself with humble people. Don't always be looking to schmooze with the rich and the famous and the powerful, whether it's in the church or wherever it may be. And then Paul concludes this verse by kind of summing it up. Do not be wise in your own opinion. Don't think too highly of yourself. The reason I say this was a common problem is I see it in the Gospels. For example, when Jesus is training the disciples, they struggle with this. In Mark 9 and 10, for example, there's a series of teachings that the Lord gives the disciple, and they revolve around this idea because the disciples were thinking too highly of themselves. You may remember, for example, in Mark 9, he has to rebuke the disciples because they devalue a guy who's casting out demons in the name of the Lord because that guy's not one of them. And the Lord has to rebuke them. And then he has to rebuke them about their attitude towards children. Then he has to rebuke them about their attitude towards women in a marriage relationship. They thought that they were better than the wives, or they thought that men were better than their wives in the marriage relationship. And when Jesus rebukes a rich guy, they're offended by that. Say, wait a second, we like that guy. He's somebody we can look up to. He's the kind of guy we want to rub shoulders with. And they go, well, if the rich can't be saved, then who can? Wait a second. So their mentality was completely wrong. And then James chapter 1, James says, do you want to be unstained by the world? And he's talking to believers there. What he means is, it's so easy for believers to think like the world, to have our lives stained by the influences and the desires of the world. And James says, you want to avoid that? Visit orphans and widows. Reminds me so much of what Paul says here in Romans 12. Associate with the humble. Don't think like the world, because we have such a tendency to do that. And in James 2, that's what they're doing, because the rich guy comes in and they go, oh, sit here in the front. We want to be next to you. And the poor person, you say, oh, get in the back, sit way back there. And James has to remind them, that's the way the world thinks. And we see it in all these books of the New Testament. I just picked 3 examples here, and there's many more. This is a sin that I don't think we take seriously enough. When we think too highly of ourselves, let's ask the Lord to change our mind. Romans 12, 1 and 2. Be transformed by the renewing of our mind. And then let's do what we can to help avoid this sin in our lives by associating with the humble and not thinking too highly of ourselves when we do that. If you like this video, I'd ask that you'd press the like button and the subscribe button. And remember, keep grace in focus.